Our third and final speaker will be Ben Schacht. Ben is a public humanist and independent scholar. He is a board member and programs chair of the Chicago YIVO Society. The title of Ben's talk is The Jewish Worker as Organic Intellectual, the Case of Abraham Bisno.
Right, thank you very much. So first, I want to thank the organizers of Farbindungen and my fellow panelists and our moderator and all the presenters at the conference whose presentations I found really stimulating and informative. It's really been a pleasure to attend the conference so far and see a lot of people, some of whom I know in person and others I've met in virtual Yiddish classrooms. So in the program, my talk is titled The Jewish Worker as Organic Intellectual, the Case of Abraham Bisno. But while preparing the presentation, I realized that a more accurate subtitle actually was The Life of Abraham Bisno, because it really is Bisno's life that I'm interested in. And what I want to suggest to you today is that the way that he lived his life personifies this idea of the organic intellectual, which I'll try to give a more precise definition of in a moment. But before we get ahead of ourselves, who was Abraham Bisno? The short answer: Bisno was a Jewish immigrant to Chicago from Eastern Europe in the late 19th century who became an influential trade union leader among the city's Jewish and non-Jewish garment workers. And I became interested in Bisno a little over a year ago while writing an essay for the Newberry Library's digital collections for the Classroom Project on life, labor, and culture among Chicago's Jewish immigrant garment workers around the turn of the 20th century. And Bisno was one of three Jewish immigrants whose life stories I studied. The other two were Hildesat Polacek and Philip Bregstone, who you can see on the right side of the screen there. All three worked in Chicago's garment industry, but it was Bisno whose life was most deeply enmeshed in it. And part of what draws me to Bisno is the blend of theory and practice that we find when we study his life. And that's one of the hallmarks of the organic intellectual, a term I now want to turn to explicitly. So the term was coined by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, for whom it formed part of a larger theory of intellectuals and ideological hegemony that he elaborated in his prison notebooks, which he wrote while imprisoned by the fascist government of Benito Mussolini during the 1920s and 30s. According to Gramsci, every society gives rise to intellectuals who develop organically and who embody and express the ideas and interests of the groups or the classes to which they belong. For example, in the medieval world, ecclesiastical authorities in partnership with feudal aristocrats explained and justified the feudal order through religious doctrine. Likewise, in capitalist societies, entrepreneurs and economists give voice to the ethos of capitalism, justifying its distribution of wealth, power, and income in terms of the entrepreneur's innovative and productive contributions. And intellectuals like these help to produce what Gramsci called hegemony, that is, the tacit acceptance and legitimacy of the social order, which is partly secured through the articulation of dominant cultural values. But intellectuals are not the province of ruling classes alone. According to Gramsci, intellect is democratic, it's diffused throughout society, it's present even in the lowliest forms of labor. He says that there is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation is excluded, can be excluded. Homo faber, the making human, cannot be separated from Homo sapiens, the thinking human. So everyone is to some extent an intellectual, even if they don't have an officially recognized intellectual position, Gramsci argues. And the organic intellectuals of the working class form their ideas through their experiences of work and the technical knowledge and skills that their work demands. And they draw on this knowledge as they attempt to organize production along democratic and egalitarian lines, seeking to produce a counter-hegemony to the ruling strictures of unregulated market competition, profit, private property, and so on. And so working class organic intellectuals, according to Gramsci, they synthesize theory and practice. And he says the mode of being of the new intellectual can no longer consist in eloquence, but in active participation in practical life as constructor, organizer, permanent persuader. And I really can't think of a better way to describe Bisno than as a constructor, as an organizer, and as a permanent persuader. And I think we can see this when we look more closely at his life. He was born into a poor Jewish family in the town of Vasilkov, Ukraine in 1866. His father was a tailor whose forebears had moved to Ukraine from Lithuania in search of better job prospects. And according to Bisno, life in Vasilkov, quote, was one stretch of sickness, great poverty, and hard labor. At home, the family spoke Yiddish. quote, a composite of words picked up in the travels of the race, mainly a German dialect with Hebrew, Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, Spanish, and English words intermixed in Bisno's colorful description. Despite his young age, Bisno was a keen observer of his social environment, and in his autobiography, he describes both intra-Jewish social relations and Jewish relations with surrounding non-Jewish peasants in the community. And it's clear that the culture of the non-Jewish peasants made a great impression on him. His direct, occasionally lyrical descriptions of doing agricultural work among peasants and his frank observations about peasant sexuality show him to have had an anthropological turn of mind from a young age. And he articulated the combined influence of his Jewish and non-Jewish peasant surroundings in the following words, quote, in myself all through life I have felt the imprint of those two forces. The theoretic Jew in me has made me stop to understand the movements of life, and the example of the doing peasant has made me demand action in all my dealings with life. His attention to the active and practical sides of life are reflected in his early experiences of work. As a child, Bisno was apprenticed to a master tailor in a nearby town, where he struggled to learn the trade and suffered severe beatings at the hands of his impatient, hot-tempered master, a situation which led him to flee his apprenticeship in the dead of winter in an active rebellion that foreshadowed his later career as a labor radical. His family moved to Kiev eventually and survived a pogrom there in the spring of 1881. And with the support of the Alliance Israël Universelle, a French philanthropic organization, the Bisnos emigrated to the United States, and they spent a year in the South before they settled in Chicago in 1882. And although Bisno's family earned decent money working as contractors in Chicago's garment industry, the young Abraham was drawn to the various radical and socialist currents then circulating in Chicago's immigrant working class milieus. In 1886, Chicago became the epicenter of the movement for an 8-hour workday, which was quite a radical cause at the time. In May of that year, the city saw tens of thousands of workers go on strike, demanding shorter hours. In his autobiography, Bisno describes attending labor organizing meetings of Jewish and non-Jewish workers as word spread that workers everywhere were on the march for better conditions. And he recounts hearing a speech by the German anarchist and newspaper editor August Spies, who spoke in a, quote, plain German that Bisno, as a native Yiddish speaker, could understand. And in Bisno's recollection, Spies described how the development of modern industry made possible the supersession of capitalism by socialism, which would put an end to class hierarchies and usher in a new era of egalitarian cooperation. And this idea set the young Bisno aflame. That's the word that he uses in his autobiography. Just a few weeks later, August Spies would become known for his participation in the infamous Haymarket affair, in which someone hurled a bomb into the ranks of police officers attempting to disperse a gathering of workers near the Haymarket Square on the evening of May 4th, 1886. The following day, Bisno and his fellow Jewish garment workers, unaware of what had transpired the night before, led a march from the Jewish ghetto on the near west side of the city to the inside shops downtown, demanding fairer working conditions, only to be beaten by police as they crossed the Van Buren Street Bridge across the Chicago River. And this was part of the wave of repression that followed the Haymarket bombing. And Spies and 7 other anarchists, mostly German immigrants, were tried and convicted for murder for the throwing of this bomb, even though the identity of the bomb thrower was never determined. And Spies and 3 other defendants were hanged in November of 1887. The Haymarket was a setback for the labor movement, but it also planted radical seeds. Amidst the post-Haymarket ferment, Bisno went on to found the Jewish Workingmen's Educational Society. The society hosted lectures and organizing meetings and became the nucleus of the city's burgeoning Jewish labor movement. According to Bisno's contemporary, Philip Bregstone, quote, it was there that the Jewish labor movement, Jewish radicalism, socialism, and anarchism in this city first saw the light of day. In 1890, Bisno was elected the first president of the Chicago Cloakmakers Union. And Bisno's work as the leader of the Cloakmakers Union brought him into the orbit of Hull House, a social settlement located at Polk and Halsted Streets, abutting the multi-ethnic neighborhood where Chicago's Jewish ghetto was located. Hull House offered opportunities for cultural enrichment, and it also served as a hub for labor organizing and a lecture hall where radical views were aired and vigorously debated. And you can be sure that Bisno participated in these debates. At Hull House, Bisno became acquainted with Florence Kelley, a Hull House resident who had studied socialism in Europe and corresponded with prominent European socialist leaders such as Friedrich Engels, whose 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, Kelley translated into English. Bisno and Kelly respected each other's intellects and experiences and worked together to pass a law abolishing child labor and restricting the workday for women to 8 hours in 1893. And the law also established a state factory inspectorate, which Kelly became the leader of, and she appointed Bisno as a deputy factory inspector. And in his autobiography, Bisno described these years as years when I studied the labor problem as never before, not from books, but from actual industry. So part of this law ended up being struck down by the Illinois Supreme Court. And in 1896, a new governor was elected who was less sympathetic to the cause of labor, and that put an end to Bisno's career as a factory inspector. But it did not end his intellectual efforts to understand the social and working conditions that he and his fellow working class immigrants faced. And nor did it stop him from continuing to contribute to sociological research that would inform public policy. For 6 months in 1900, he traveled around the country, the United States, that is, with the University of Wisconsin economist John R. Commons, collecting data and documenting the conditions of immigrants and workers in a variety of locations and industries for the federal government's Industrial Commission, an initiative begun during the presidency of William McKinley. In his autobiography, Commons devotes several paragraphs to Bisno's influence on his research and outlook. Bisno opened a new world for me, Commons writes, not only in the life of the immigrant, but also in economic theory, Karl Marx, and labor unionism. He was my daily seminar for 6 months. And I think Commons' take on Bisno's own philosophy is worth quoting. According to Commons, Bisno had worked out a philosophy of his own through some 20 years of sweatshop life, which I afterward recognized as syndicalism and the American IWW, the International Workers of the World. So in the few minutes that I have left, I want to turn to some of the Yiddish sources, both by and on Bisno, that I've come across, because that's where my attention has been lately. And my sense is that these are largely unexplored sources for understanding Bisno's life. And so one source that I want to direct your attention toward first is the testimony of his Yiddish-speaking contemporaries, one of whom was the Yiddish socialist journalist for the Vorwärts, Ben Zion Hoffman, also known by his pen name Tsivian. And he described Bisno in a chapter that's devoted just to Bisno in Hoffman's history, 50 Jahre Cloakmaker Union, 50 years of the Cloakmakers Union, that he published in 1936. And you can read it on the Yiddish Book Center's website. And so I think this quote just underscores the qualities of the organic intellectual that I've been trying to pull out of Bisno's life here. According to Hoffman, Bisno did not receive an elementary education as a child. He was the son of a poor tailor, and while he was still in his early years, he was compelled to work, but he had great innate abilities and the desire to be useful to his fellow human beings. He learned how to speak English well and read a lot, and thought much about what he read. He had the ability to think through a question deeply and fundamentally and to consider it from all sides. And this picture of a young Hoffman here is from 50 Jahre Cloakmaker Union, as well as the picture on my opening slide of Bisno that I started with. So that's one Yiddish source that I think is interesting to look at. And Hoffman's whole book is a really fascinating picture of garment worker unionism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then I want to turn lastly to Bisno's own Yiddish journalism. And here I want to look at Yiddischer Arbeiterwelt, Jewish labor world. And I believe Carolyn Luce mentioned the newspaper in her keynote talk yesterday. And this is a socialist, labor-oriented weekly newspaper that was published in Chicago starting in 1908. Sometime in the late teens, it became a daily newspaper and eventually merged with the Vorwärts, and there was a Chicago edition of the Vorwärts. But the National Library of Israel has digitized the newspaper starting from 1908, going through the first few months of 1917. So there's a lot you can read there. And when you put Bisno's name into the search bar, dozens and dozens of results come up. And some of these results take you to articles referencing him, talking about speeches he's going to be giving in various locations in Chicago. There's an interview with him about how negotiations are going between manufacturers associations and the labor unions in Chicago's garment industry. But then you also get a lot of articles by Bisno. So I just wanted to close by referencing two articles that seem to me to indicate Bisno's relevance to today. And that's kind of the note that I want to end on, thinking about his relevance today. The Coming Immigration, its effect on the labor movement, which appeared on December 29th, 1916, and relations between different peoples in industry, which appeared in January 1917. I think they show that despite having died nearly a century ago, Bisno remains a relevant figure today. So thank you very much.